All right, throughout this last week, I was reading chapter 3 in Fire in California's Ecosystems, and that whole chapter was about fire weather principles. So basically, how does temperature, wind, humidity, stability, precipitation, how does all of that factor into wildfire behavior? And learn some great lessons on how I can improve my ability to forecast these events, especially in terms of stability. That was my weak point, but one of the key things that I've been thinking about is that the weather, while there's good principles to understand when it comes to how the weather interacts with wildfire, there's also a lot of nuance with it because the weather is going to be different depending on where you're talking about in California. Even along the central coast, most days I'll have a forecast high for Monterey that'll be 65 degrees, and then throughout the summer a lot of times King City's 95 degrees, and then up in the Santa Cruz Mountains it's 85 degrees, but then there's more fuel up there, so you have all of these different what you'd call microclimates. And what happens when you have lots of different weather? And again, that's just talking about the central coast. Then you can go to the southeastern parts of the state, it's a desert. And then you go up into the mountains, you have entirely different ecosystems up there. In the Central Valley, it's very different than what you'd expect on the coast, the mountains, or the desert. So, point I'm trying to put forward is that California is a very complex ecosystem. It's almost hard to say California has an ecosystem because there's really so many different ecosystems all built into one. And what's important is with all these different, what you'd call microclimates, where it's cooler on the coast, usually warmer inland, maybe more or less humidity in the deserts, obviously, that is going to interact with the environment, and that's going to determine the plants that you have in those areas. So what's going to happen is you end up with very different plant communities in each of these places. Along the coast, we usually have what you call maybe coastal scrub, or in Santa Cruz, we have a lot of maybe eucalyptus trees, not technically native, but extremely flammable. That's important for wildfire. But then up in the mountains, there's very shaded areas in the Santa Cruz Mountains that have rich redwood forests. But then you maybe go around the other side of the hill, and it's dense chaparral, which can burn very intensely. And each of these communities is going to interact with wildfire in a different way. And maybe the problems in each community are different, and then the solutions are going to be different as well. And that's the main idea that I'm putting forward right now, is that there isn't one grand solution. Like in these videos, I talk about how we need to live with fire, and that sounds like a grand solution where it's just, oh, we've figured it out. There's a problem. Wildfire in California over the last decade, we've had all these extreme fires, we've lost thousands of structures, we've lost countless lives, and here's the solution. We just need to live with fire. And while that maybe is true, it also depends on the community that you're talking about. So just for example, I mentioned earlier how even within the Santa Cruz Mountains, you'll have some chaparral and you'll have some redwood forests. Now, how those communities, maybe living near those two plant ecosystems, how they would live with fire would be completely different. So if you're close to the chaparral, for example, chaparral is not supposed to burn every 5 years or every 10 years. It's maybe supposed to burn every 30 to 50 years for it to be a healthy ecosystem. And when it's very dense, that's actually a pretty healthy chaparral. But it does burn very extremely. I don't know if that's correct grammar, but if you're close to the chaparral, the best thing to do is maybe just clear a fuel break, like between you and the chaparral. And then let the chaparral do its thing. Maybe when lightning comes in, it does burn out some of that chaparral, but it wouldn't be right to do a prescribed burn in the chaparral every 5 to 10 years because that's not how those plants evolved over thousands of years with wildfire. Those plants evolved on the Central Coast. Lightning rarely ever happened, so fires rarely ever happened. So a lot of those plants evolve to burn every 50 years, and then they store up all their resources in what you call a burl underneath the ground. They build up seed banks where they drop all these seeds that don't germinate until a fire comes through. And then the burl has all its resources, a fire comes through, and then you get re-sprouts out of the burl. But those plants were evolved for fire maybe every 50 years. If you had a fire every 5 years because you're thinking, oh, we need to live with fire, we need to be doing prescribed burns all the time in the chaparral, the burl wouldn't have enough time to restore all of its resources, and the seeds wouldn't have enough time to kind of build up their savings in that seed bank in the soil. And then all of a sudden, those plants wouldn't be able to recover from fire, which they're naturally adapted to do over a longer time span. They would most likely die, and then you just have some non-native grasses or something come in, and then you have a completely different fire regime and maybe worse wildfire than you had before because you were trying to live with fire, maybe trying to do the right thing, but you were going about it in the wrong way. Now, it could be a different example of, I'll use giant sequoia up in the Sierra. I think that's a good example because we have a lot more lightning up there. Historically, you'd maybe have fires come through every 10 years, and that would clear out a lot of the fuels. And that was the healthiest environment for those giant sequoias. They would drop their seeds, and then just like the plants in the chaparral, those seeds wouldn't germinate, or the cones, the seeds within the cones, I think that's how you'd call it, those wouldn't germinate until a fire came through. And the reason for that's actually pretty cool. It's because, think about it, when a fire comes through, it clears out all the competition. And then that seed germinates. It's almost like the fire, the heat from it pops the cone open. And then all of a sudden, that plant that would have been competing for light, for water, now has this whole environment that maybe has more nutrients because of all the maybe ash around it. And then free sunlight because a lot of the competition's been cleared out. And it's just a perfect environment for that seed to have the greatest probability that it ends up growing to adulthood. So in a sequoia environment up in the Sierra, you maybe have fire come through every 10 years. It clears out the fuels, and that's also a good thing because if those fuels build up over a long period of time, if it becomes very dense like the chaparral, maybe dense vegetation healthy in the chaparral, dense vegetation around giant sequoias, could lead to such extreme fires that it overwhelms the giant sequoia's natural defenses, like fire-resistant bark and self-pruning where it drops all its lower branches. If you have a bunch of dense trees around your giant sequoias, the fire can just be so intense that doesn't matter you have fireproof bark, doesn't matter that you do self-pruning, it kills the giant sequoia. So, in that case, it would be smart to allow fire every 5 to 10 years. And when I say allow fire, there's a few different ways to think about that because obviously if there's structures or people near a fire, you can't just say, oh, we're trying to live with fire now, so we're just going to let the fire do its thing. And then it goes through a community. I don't think anybody would be on board with that. But there is something to be said for maybe allowing a fire to burn if it's not currently putting anyone's life or anyone's property in danger, because it allows the California ecosystem to do what it's supposed to do. And I believe this is the way they do it up in Montana. At least they used to. If a fire started from lightning, they would let it burn because that's kind of the natural ecosystem up there. So then if you allow that to happen, then it actually just naturally promotes how the plants have evolved. So you could say what they like and what is going to be best for them and what's going to lead to the healthiest environment. When you lead to fire suppression up in the Sierra, you have all the fuels build up. That's bad because 1, it can just lead to very extreme fires. 2, you end up with all of these plants sharing the same amount of water when normally fire would have cleared them out in the past. So those plants didn't evolve for a small amount of water. And then all of a sudden they don't have enough water, so they're dry, they're unhealthy, they're more susceptible to pest and disease, and that's a big part of the reason we had the bark beetle problem in the Sierra, and we have millions of dead trees up there now. So that was a long-winded way of saying what you would decide to do to live with fire depends on the community. So when I say we need to live with fire, I'm never going to put forward like an idea that says, oh, we need to do prescribed burning every 5 years and we need to do fuel breaks and fuel reduction. While all of that maybe would be true across the board on average, what is actually going to be best for each community is for each community to understand their environment, to understand the science behind wildfire, and then to figure out what is best in the environment that surrounds them, taking all of the different factors into account. So that's part of the reason I'm reading Fire in California's Ecosystem, so that I can understand the nuances between all the different ecosystems or bioregions in California. There's actually, I think, there's a whole section in this book that goes through the 9 different bioregions in California and talks about the history of fire, how it's different in each, and then maybe how the behavior of fire is different in each and how some of the solutions are going to be different in each. That's at least what I'm hoping it goes into. I'm trying to understand that so that I can understand some of the, I think the word is intricacies between these different ecosystems. But I'm also never going to just say, oh, I read in this book in the Klamath Mountains we're supposed to do this, and then I'll tell the Klamath Mountain community what they should be doing. I think the people who know best are the people who actually live in the community, and especially the people who not only live in the community, but also have a background in wildfire. So I think that's also where I can come in a little bit. As I go through this book, I'm just communicating everything I learn about wildfire. So if you want to be one of the people in your community who can be part of the change to living with fire, a big part of that is you understanding wildfire as well. And you can learn at least something from my channel, but a lot of the best learning I find just happens on your own. So there's lots of books I could recommend out there. Now the next question I think that popped up into my head is, okay, why should we live with fire? I've kind of put that phrase out there, but I haven't really explained it yet. The basic summary is, for a long period of time in California, the Native Americans lived with fire, and they used it to their advantage. They would use fire to clear fuel breaks around their villages so they were protected. They'd use it for long distance communication, for hunting game, for promoting certain crops that they either like to eat, or they'd use the materials for things like basket weaving. They'd even use it in warfare. So they came to California, they realized, oh, fire is a natural part of the California ecosystem. Instead of trying to fight this thing that is going to happen in California whether we like it or not, let's learn how to live with it and maybe even use it to our advantage. And they did that extremely well. Then the Euro-American settlers came in, and in the early 1900s, there were some huge fires. I believe it was in Montana and Idaho. And I forget the exact number. I think it was something like 78 firefighters died. And it was just devastating fires up there. So after that, we switched our mindset on fire. And we maybe switched it a little bit before that, but that was what really kind of changed our philosophy and our mindset towards fire in maybe all of the United States, but it's especially important for California because California, you're supposed to have fire. And from that point, it was a war against wildfire. But the problem is if fire is a natural part of the California ecosystem, and like I explained in the chaparral, you have burls, you have seed banks, you have giant sequoias that have fire-resistant bark with seeds that only germinate after a fire comes through. These plants have not only evolved with fire, but in some cases they actually depend on fire for their survival. And then a lot of the animals rely on those plants, so then the animals are also tied in with fire as well. It's just a part of California. So we can try to bend reality as much as we can, and maybe we can get away with it in the short run, but eventually reality is going to snap back. And that's something that we saw happen over this last decade, where maybe at 100 years of fire suppression, we started to maybe change our thinking, I believe in the 1960s, that, oh, this is maybe not a good thing for California. Maybe the fuels are building up too much. Maybe this is actually leading to worse wildfires. And maybe we need to change our mind. But, I mean, if you actually look at the overall practices today, it does still seem like we have a war against wildfire. And it seems like fire is still viewed as the enemy. So why shouldn't we view fire as the enemy? Because it certainly is something that's dangerous. It's certainly something that can destroy your property, destroy your life, take your loved ones away from you. There are lots of arguments to be made that fire is bad. What I'm putting forward is that while you could say that, having that mindset isn't actually what's going to make fire better. Because if you have this idea that we have a war against fire, then you think, okay, put out the fires as fast as possible. Then you put out the fires as fast as possible, and the fuels that should have burned out, and maybe it wasn't even a fire that was threatening anybody, all those fuels start to accumulate. And then they accumulate over a longer and longer period of time. Maybe some of those plants just die from natural causes, and then a fire doesn't clear out those dead plants. Now you just have a bunch of dead vegetation sitting there that's extremely dry. You have what I talked about earlier, where you have a large amount of live plants sharing the same amount of water. Each one has less water than it needs. Each one is drier than it should be. Each one is weaker than it should be. You end up just with this ticking time bomb in the environment. And eventually that bomb is going to go off. So what ends up happening is, instead of having an environment where maybe you have slow burning, kind of calm, I don't want to say calm fires, but just fires that maybe burn over a period of weeks, and they slowly just move through the environment, and they burn out some bushes and some trees and clear out some of the grasses that would have been burning maybe for 2 to 3 months at a time. What ends up happening is we extinguish all of the fires until you get the day where we don't have the ability to extinguish it, until it's so hot, so dry, so windy that our fire suppression resources just aren't enough to stop that fire. And then all of a sudden, that fire that is now taking off has all of the fuels that should have burnt out from all of the fires that should have happened over the last few decades. So then that fire becomes extreme, and it becomes a much greater threat to property and life than if we had allowed just all those little fires to happen. So in thinking we need to put out every fire, it ends up leading to more extreme wildfires in the future. So then I guess you could make the argument, and I'm not here to say who's correct on this, you could say that maybe a few massive extreme wildfires every decade is preferable to constant, numerous, but not intense, not as dangerous fires every single year, and maybe hundreds of them every single year that we just kind of allow to burn. You could make the argument there. Overall, I think most of the better arguments, I think, are on the side of the slow burning camp, because you might be able to say, well, if you have a few fires then versus hundreds of fires, then overall you're actually going to only have really bad air quality for a short period of time versus maybe having consistent kind of bad air quality throughout every summer. But then you can also make the argument that when you have those extreme fires, everything burns because you have continuous ladder fuels. So it goes into the grasses, the brush, the trees, and then that kicks up way more smoke than if you had just allowed the grasses to burn, maybe every year, instead of everything burning in 10 years or once every 10 years. So it doesn't really work to think of fire as the enemy, because fire is just a natural part of the California ecosystem. It's a part of the environment, whether we like it or not. And it comes down to this idea of, do we want to maybe do what's harder right now, which is having the strength and the courage to allow some fires to burn? And that doesn't mean allowing them to burn on the most extreme days, but using the science that we have. Technology has come a very long way. This is something I was working On with at San Jose State under the Fire Weather Research Laboratory. We have technology now. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good, where we plug in the temperature, the wind, the humidity, the topography, the fuels, the fuel moistures into this model with the current fire perimeter, and we're able to map where that fire is going to go throughout the day today. So you can use that kind of technology to make your fire suppression efforts maybe more effective, or to choose if maybe today, where the fire is going to go, it's actually not going to be a huge danger. It's going to clear out some fuels that should have been cleared out 50 years ago. This might actually be a fire that we let burn today. But then maybe another day it's very extreme conditions and it shows that the fire is just going to take off and go straight towards the community. Then maybe that's the day that you bring in the planes and the helicopters and the crews to kind of suppress it. Now, obviously, I'm not part of that fire suppression world, so I'm sure it's much easier said than done. But those are the kind of conversations that we can be having. And maybe if a fire is burning up in the wilderness, we just let it burn instead of throwing millions of dollars on it to put it out, when we could maybe spend half as much money doing some prescribed burns that actually reduces fire danger in a much more effective way. So using the science to our advantage, I think, is the main idea that I'm putting forward right there. But again, I just want to get back to that idea that we can either do what is maybe harder in the present moment, and having individual people from their communities adopt this responsibility, say, you know what, I live in the Santa Cruz Mountains. I feel responsible for my property first of all. I'm going to clean up my property so that I'm at least not a danger to myself or my neighbors. And then maybe once I get my property figured out, maybe I go help my neighbor because they're old and I don't want them walking on their roof clearing out their gutters. So maybe I go up there with the leaf blower and I do it for them. And then you do that throughout your neighborhood, and then maybe it starts a little trend. All of a sudden your city has done it. And all of a sudden, now if a fire comes through, all of your properties are so prepared for fire that the danger has significantly decreased. And then, as I mentioned, each community maybe does things differently depending on the plants that they have around. Maybe you're in a place that you don't actually have fire danger, so you don't have to worry about it. Maybe you're in a place where you need the entire community to come together and every single person does as much as they possibly can to keep your community safe, because that is a big part of being a part of a community, is kind of looking out for each other, protecting each other, putting in what may be some hard work in the present moment to make sure that you keep your loved ones and the ones around you safe. And trust me, I know fire or fuel reduction can be some pretty hard work. I've spent those long days up on a hillside with 2 leaf blowers where you're blowing all the leaves out, then you're dragging branches down, putting them in a chipper. Some of the chipper stuff is going in your eyes and it's going in your nose, and maybe somebody accidentally puts poison oak in the chipper, so then it goes up into the air and then everyone gets really bad poison oak. It is difficult. I'm not going to paint some picture about how it's also kind of fun in a weird way, and it maybe is a good way to... It's hard to be like anxious or depressed if you're actively working hard at something, or you could even say suffering. That usually takes up your whole mind and diverts your attention away from maybe some of the problems that you can create in your own life when you maybe aren't solving the problems that you should already. But it is kind of fun. It is challenging, but it is worth it. And you get that sense of satisfaction afterwards, knowing that you put in a good hard day's work. And because of that, you are safer, your family is safer, your property is safer, and your community is safer. And that is a good feeling that I think we can't just expect other people to solve the problem for us. I think this is a problem that can only be solved if each person decides to step up in the way that they know how. So not everybody is going to be reading a 500-page textbook to know exactly what the plan should be. Maybe you only need one person per community to be that person. And we have a lot of retired firefighters out there, maybe people who are still working in the fire service who know exactly what we should be doing. And then maybe each person just goes to that person and says, hey, what can I do? What can I do to do my part so that I'm part of the solution instead of being part of the problem? And yeah, I think that's just about the best thing we can ask for as of right now. But the one last thing that I want to put forward is that we do need to understand that it's not all fear when it comes to wildfire. I think there actually is a fair bit of hope. It's easy for this to just feel like a problem that's bigger than you. It's easy to think that, oh, this is statewide. It's maybe even all over the West. Fuels have been building up for 100 years. I don't have any expertise in this. I don't know what to do. Maybe I don't have the abilities or the materials to really do all that much. And it's just too big of a problem. I'll just hope somebody else solves it. And maybe I'll just pretend that somebody else is going to solve it so that I can feel like I'm safe. But it's solvable. And there are small things every single person can do to solve this problem. Whether it's just clearing some of the fuels just around your house, that is better than if you didn't clear the fuels at all. And I think this is a problem that only gets solved if we bring it back to the individual level and get each person on board to do what is up to their abilities. If you can do more, then you can put more of that responsibility on your back and carry the team a little bit. But if you can't, then that's fine. Just do the part that you can. But we need to understand that it's not something that's out of our control completely. It's actually completely within our control because it's not a mystery how these big wildfires happen. It's the fire behavior triangle: fuel, weather, topography. Topography, we're probably not going to change that. We're not going to fill in canyons so we don't get up canyon winds in the afternoon that promote fire behavior. That sounds unreasonable. Weather, we can maybe start to trend in the direction where we try to reduce our CO2 emissions because, my research, my advisor's research, as well as research from hundreds of other wildfire scientists, has shown that as the climate warms, things typically get drier. As things get drier, the fuels get drier, and then you get worse wildfires. The research I did at San Jose State shows that. And it shows it's actually pretty drastic as well. That's a pretty hard problem to solve, and the solutions would be far down the line. And this is kind of a problem that we need to solve today. So we can start working in that direction, but with the understanding that it's not going to solve our problem right now, or potentially even in my lifetime. Because I believe CO2 stays in the atmosphere for like 10,000 years or something. Don't quote me on that. So whatever is in the atmosphere right now is still going to be in there in 2100. We can at least reduce the increase. That could be a good goal to shoot for. But we already have very extreme wildfires, so there's something else we need to do if we want this problem to actually stop. We want people to stop losing their houses, want people to stop losing their lives, and that's on the third side of the fire behavior triangle, which is fuel. And that is something that we can do. We can either just clear the fuels ourselves with chainsaws and chippers, or we can try to adopt some of those Native American principles and truly live with fire, where we're using prescribed fire to kind of do the work for us and mimicking the way the California ecosystem is actually supposed to be. So it's not only healthy for us, but it's healthy for our environment, and we're just living in balance with the environment. And as we adopt the responsibility to solve this problem, it gives us something to do. It gives us a goal to work towards each day. It gives you that sense of achievement, but also that journey of transformation, knowing that you're making a positive change in the world and that you're just bringing good into the world. So that's just my thoughts for today. Hopefully you learned something. And this is kind of something I plan on doing every Sunday, just trying to mold these ideas. As you could probably tell, they're still very disorganized, and I'm actively working on these ideas as I'm talking about them. So that's something I'm most likely going to do every Sunday, just trying to figure out what this idea is that I'm trying to put forward, because I don't have it all figured out right now. So maybe someday I will, but maybe it's also just one of those journeys where I progress and get better, but there's actually no final destination. So if you want to come along on this journey as well, you can stay tuned. The next chapter in Fire in California's Ecosystems looks pretty technical, but it also looks pretty interesting. So I'll be covering that this next week, and thanks for watching.